Hi, welcome to Lab 2, Anatomy Physiology 2. And we are starting to look at the heart, and we're going to look at the ECG tracings. Now, back in my day, they were called EKG tracings because the machine that did the test was made in Germany, and they spell cardia with a K. I think it's interesting that you're going to look at the anatomy of a human heart and the anatomy of a pig heart. They are similar but not the same. And just yesterday was the first time in history that they transplanted a pig's heart into a human. So it's just a timely experiment they were doing at the same time it's happening in history. Since we're not meeting in person, we're not going to be using the BioPack system, and you're not going to be tracing ECG tracings. However, when school does come back and we start meeting again, if you'd like, we'll pull it out and you guys can hook yourself up and do some EKG or ECG tracings if you'd like. At the end, we're going to see some abnormal heart tracings. And we're going to find out why they're abnormal, why the tracing looks the way it is. So that's an overview of what we're going to do for this lab. These are the 10 terms that you need to be able to find, and you need to be able to spell them. So not so hard. We're looking at the external view, so that means the part that's on the outside, and then we're going to have a sliced open section where you can look inside. And this is the anterior view. So if you remember anterior and posterior, posterior is in the back, anterior is in the front. So if you're looking at this, you know that here's a version of the heart that's labeled. And let me point out a few things. Okay, everything on this side is the right side of the heart, and everything on this side is the left side of the heart. And if you look, you have the superior and inferior vena cava. So that always kind of helps you know which side of the heart you're looking at. And you have the aortic arch right there. And then it's going to go on down into the abdominal region and be the abdominal aorta. And this is one of the most interesting things that I think about the heart. So here is your left coronary artery. Here is your right coronary artery. And so when somebody has a coronary, everybody just goes, oh, well, they had a heart attack. Well, what happened was the heart itself couldn't get enough blood, and so the tissue started dying. And you're thinking, well, it's full of blood. You know, how could it run out of blood? Well, the blood on the inside can't make it all the way to the outside of the heart, where all this muscle tissue is. So you have to have blood vessels on the outside of your heart that nourish the heart muscle. And so if you get a blockage in one of these coronary arteries, then you're not going to get blood flow, and the tissue downstream is going to die. Now, you've probably heard about somebody having a double bypass or a quadruple bypass. What they have to do in people who have these blocked or narrowed is they'll go and take a blood vessel from somewhere else in your body, usually your leg, and they'll cut it out and they'll sew it and bypass the blocked area so that you now have blood flow going down to the rest of the heart. Here's a bypass operation. So here's the heart. Here's the sterile drape. And they're laying that piece of blood vessel. Looks a little bit like spaghetti, doesn't it? All right, and then they're going to sew the edges together. Unfortunately, in this picture, they've made the pulmonary trunk and then the arteries coming off from the left and off from the right, blue or purple. And that's what we reserve for veins. And then they made the pulmonary veins right there that come back from the lungs. They made those red. So they're not using the convention, so don't get confused by the colors there. All right, so to recap, you have the superior and inferior vena cava, you have the aorta, the aortic arch, the pulmonary trunk, and then the pulmonary arteries coming off of that to the left and to the right. The right coronary artery feeding the outside of the heart, the left coronary artery feeding the left side of the heart. And then we didn't talk about the flaps here, but this flap right here is the right atrium, and there's the left atrium. And here's the right ventricle, and there's the left ventricle. And from the outside, you can't really tell, but once we cut it open, it's easy to see that there's actually two chambers here. After you've learned those 10 things on the external view of the heart, look at the next page, and here are the things that they want you to know once you cut the heart open and look on the inside. So here's your internal view. Here's the right atrium, and there's the left atrium over here. You see it right there. Now, look at this. This is a little bit confusing. This is the right atrium. This is the right ventricle over here. And this is the pulmonary trunk that's going to exit the right ventricle. Here's the division right here that divides the right side from the left side. And when you're looking at the heart, even if you couldn't see this part up here to give you a clue of what's going on, you could look at the wall of the heart. Look at the wall over here. The right side has a rather thin wall, and the left side has a very thick wall. And the reason for that, when the heart contracts, you're going to squeeze blood out of the heart. You're going to push it out either through the pulmonary trunk or through the aorta. And this one is going to have to exit and just go over to the lungs, which are very close by. So you don't want too much pressure, because if your heart beats too hard and pushes the blood too hard through the pulmonary trunk and then the pulmonary arteries over to the lungs, you'd actually hurt the lungs. You'd damage the lungs. So you don't need as thick or muscular a wall on the right side to push the blood out to the lungs. But on the left side, where you're going to be squeezing the blood out, and it's going to be going through the aorta and going up to the brain, down to the rest of the body, down along the vertebra, so for your abdominal aorta, you've got to make it all the way to your toes and your fingertips. So you're going to need a much more powerful push. So you have a thicker wall on the left side, which is going to go to the entire body. You need to know 4 different sets of valves in the heart. 2 of them are easy to find. They separate the right atria from the right ventricle and the left atria from the left ventricle. Now, all of the 4 valves that we're going to be talking about have flaps. So here you're seeing some of those flaps. And all of them have 3 flaps, with the exception of this one that separates the left atrium to the left ventricle, and it is a bicuspid. It only has 2 flaps, where this one has 3. You can see 2 here, and then one's been cut away. And there's 3 here. And it tells you to look for the aortic semilunar valve. The problem with that is it's back up and under here, and you can't actually see it in this picture, right here. So we can only see 3 sets of valves. This is tricuspid, this is tricuspid, this is bicuspid, and then the one, if we could look down here and see it, right there, you would see another tricuspid. It also makes it really hard to see when they're trying to do an ultrasound and look at the flaps of your heart to see what's going on, to see what the valves are doing. I know this for a fact because they've been looking for 3 years and they still can't see my flaps. I wonder if that means I'm heartless. Even though the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve is tricuspid, we only call the one right here the tricuspid. So when they talk about the tricuspid valve, it's this one. Even though this one's tricuspid, that one's tricuspid, and that one's tricuspid. But this one is called the pulmonary semilunar valve, and this one that you can't see is the aortic semilunar valve. An interesting thing about the valves is here's one right here and over here. They don't flap up and down. They passively allow blood to flow into the heart. And let's watch this as we go in. Now they can just start pouring water inside of this heart. Obviously, this is not a living heart. So here comes the water being poured in. And as it fills up the lower chamber, as it fills up the ventricle, look what happens to the flaps. There you go. There's your tricuspid. 1, 2, 3. You're going to learn in lecture that the blood comes from the body after it's dropped off its nutrients and its oxygen, and it comes back by way of the superior and the inferior vena cava, goes into the right atrium, and then just passively falls down into the right ventricle, as we saw in the video just a second ago. Now, when the heart beats, we don't want the blood to go back up into the atria. We don't want it to exit here. We want to reroute it so it comes in here, drops down in here, and we want it to exit through the pulmonary trunk so it can go over to the heart, to the lungs from the heart and get oxygenated and then come back by way of these veins and drop off into the heart so it can be pumped throughout the body. Okay, did you follow all that? Let's try that again. Okay, in comes the blood that's dropped off its oxygen. So it comes in through the superior and inferior vena cava. It drops passively down through the atrium and down into the right ventricle. And as soon as it fills up, those flaps close, like we saw. And now when it's time for the heart to beat, we don't want it to go back up in here. We want to reroute it and have it go out here through the pulmonary semilunar valve. So what keeps this valve from just flipping open and letting the blood in? It's these heartstrings. Look at that. You always heard about, oh, you're pulling my heartstrings. You actually do have heartstrings. And of course, they're called corda tendineae. Right there. And they keep the flaps from blowing into the atrium. So think about an umbrella. When you have a big gust of wind, it flips it inside out. Well, if you had each of the ribs of your umbrella tied down to heartstrings or tied down to strings, then your umbrella couldn't flip inside out. So these flaps will not flip inside out. In that video we saw, it filled up until the flaps closed and it didn't go any further. Anytime I see something that I know that my students are going to get confused on, I point it out very carefully. So here's what you might get mixed up on. These coming out of the right ventricle is the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries. This, which comes back to the heart and brings oxygenated blood and dumps it into the heart, on the left side are the veins. So not only is that confusing, but the color is opposite of what we would have expected them to be. So I'm just pointing that out right there. And the last thing that I think I'm supposed to tell you about this is these little nipple-shaped attachments for the heartstrings, for the chordae tendineae, are called papillary muscles. So papilla means nipple-shaped. And now we have a list of 33 different things that you need to make sure that you can find in the heart. Right there. In that list of 33 terms that you need to know, here's one of them we haven't talked about. When you come up out of the aorta and you go through the aortic arch, and then you come to the descending aorta, and then you go on down to the abdominal aorta, you have a branching right here. So brachiocephalic, so this is going to come down into your brachial region, if you remember your upper arm. And cephalic, you have the cephalic artery, which we also saw, which you would think would be going up to the brain, but it's actually in the upper arm. And then there's the left common carotid and the left subclavian artery. So here are three. And interestingly, not everyone branches the same way. So if you want to pause the video and go look and see other ways the aorta branches off, we are not all made the same. But this is the general way most people are. This is the right atrium and this is the left atrium. But along the edge, there's a scalloped region. Here's your scalloped region on there. And they named that part the auricle because they said it looks like a little ear. My ears aren't scalloped, but hey, maybe yours are. Another thing doesn't make sense to me is normally when I think of the apex of something, I think of the top of something. But apex actually means pointed. So in the heart, the pointy part points down. And when we do the respiratory system, you'll see that actually it fits into an area of the lung. This is a picture of the heart, and there's your aorta and your branchings off. And this lung is over here, but look at this lung. It has this area right here where the heart actually sticks into it. If you forget whether that's the left or the right, if you can't figure it out from the picture, then what you can do is just put your hand on your heart as if you were going to say the pledge. And we always put our hands on our left side to cover up our heart. Here's a picture of the heart, and they've cut through the aorta so we can look down the aorta, and there are the three flaps, 1, 2, 3 flaps, that make up the aortic semilunar valve. They've cut away the pulmonary trunk, but if we could look down inside of it, we would see something that looked almost the same as this, but in the pulmonary branch. You can't see it in the models and the pictures that we have in the lab manual, but they want you to know about the cardiac sinuses. So we looked at the coronary arteries on the outside, and they bring nourishment to the heart. But now, once you've dropped off the oxygen, dropped off the nutrients, you have to be reoxygenated. So you've got to get that blood back out of the heart, on the outside of the heart, and back into the inside of the heart so it can be pumped over to the lungs and get oxygenated again. So what you have is you have a couple of sinuses where the blood comes back and dumps into the sinus and then is dropped off into the right atrium. Whenever I'm in another country, I try to eat the food that's given to me and be grateful for it. But I was doing a lecture tour in a country, which shall remain nameless, and they were giving me the most unusual things like dumplings full of insects and dog. And they finally brought out something, and I thought, oh my goodness, thank goodness, it's noodles. I'm so excited. And so I said, oh, what is this? And my interpreter said, it is blood tubes. So they had a bowl of arteries that they had given me to eat. It's one of the few times I said no. Not only do you need to know the left coronary artery, but you need to know that it has a branch. The branch is often called the circumflex branch of that left coronary artery. And here you go on a model. So orient yourself, and there is the coronary artery and the circumflex branch. Here's another picture. Because the circumflex artery, you can see it on the outside, but then it kind of burrows in. And so here you can see how they make it like kind of pink, showing you that it's internal. It goes inside. So it's actually nourishing some of the papilla and the left ventricle, as well as the left atria. Remember, the tricuspid valve is the one that's on the right side, separating the right ventricle and the right atria. But 3 of the 4 valves in the heart are tricuspid, but they're not the tricuspid. Another thing I should point out before I forget it is the one bicuspid valve right there is also known as the mitral valve. So you probably heard of people who have a mitral valve prolapse. It means the blood can flow back down through the valve, and you can actually hear it when you listen to the person's heart because it's kind of a squishy sound as the blood regurgitates back. The last 5 are not very obvious, and they're part of the electrical system of the heart. Right here, these. And so we're going to look at the electrical part of the heart in a different picture. Let me help you out a little bit on these pictures before we go on and learn about the bundle of His and the electrical system of the heart. Whenever you see something that looks like a series of rings like this, it's the trachea. And you guys hopefully know the trachea is your windpipe. So we know that this is going to come down and branch off, and this is going to go off to one lung, and this is going to go off to the other lung. And here's a picture. You can see the trachea right there. So see how it looks like the aorta kind of almost wraps around it like that? So that'll help you orient yourself. And so you know if this is on its way to the lung over there and this is on its way to the lung over here, these guys either have to be coming or going from the lungs too. So that's going to help you a little bit right there if you know that that's the trachea. But it's not really obvious unless because we haven't done the respiratory system yet. Another thing I can help you with is this one. This part right there is the atria. It's on the right side because there's the superior vena cava. But this is the auricle. This is the little ear-like flap right there. So when you see 2 numbers on the same thing, you're like, oh, I wonder what they want for each one of those. So that ought to help you out with that. Also notice that the apex, the pointy part, is pointing to the left in this picture, but it's pointing to the right in this picture. So what you've done is you've taken this heart and you've flipped it over, and you're actually looking from the back side. So where this is on this side is over here on this one. So don't lose your orientation. Use the apex of the heart. Here's another picture for you to label. And again, note where the apex is pointing right there. So 34 is your apex. And this one's pointing the other way, so they flip the heart. So don't get confused with that. Here's the septum that divides the left and the right. There's the septum that divides the left and the right. And if you get a little confused about that, remember to look at the width of the muscle. Look at how thick this side is versus how thick this side is. So this is the right side and this is the left side, because remember, the left side has to push all the way throughout your body, but the right side only has to push over to the lungs. Looking through the list of things that you need to be able to identify in the pig heart, there's nothing there that we haven't already done. The pulmonary trunk, left and right atrium, left and right ventricle, aortic semilunar valves. For a long time, we've been taking pig valves and putting those in people to replace defective valves. Sometimes the valves, you're born without the valve, and then other times you may get calcifications or hardening on the valve, or something damages it. You may get an infection in the heart, so you have to replace the valve. We talked about the superior and inferior vena cava, and apparently a pig heart is close enough in structure that it can be transplanted into a human, and the human can use it to beat blood through their body. This is a picture of the pig heart that they transplanted into a patient. So that's happened within this week. If we were having lab in person, we actually have a pig heart for you to look at. But since we are doing this online, then I'm just trying to show you some pictures of a pig heart to let you see. So you still have the auricle, and you can still tell that there are arteries on the outside of the heart nourishing the pig heart, just like we have. And here's a labeled model of the pig heart, so you can look inside, and the left atrium and the left ventricle. Again, look how thick that muscular wall is on the left side versus the muscular wall on the right side. It's easy to tell the left and the right by looking at this. And then there's the interventricular septum that keeps the left and the right side of the heart separated. And we're going to find out that's really important when we do the lecture part, because you don't want the oxygenated blood and the unoxygenated blood mingling. So you actually have like two complete separate halves of your heart that are separated by this septum. In lecture, you're going to learn about how muscles work, how nerves work, and you know that it's electrical. So you have all of these muscle cells making up the heart, and it's important that the whole heart beats as one. So we have gap junctions that allow the cells to communicate with each other quickly. So when we're doing skeletal muscle, we learn that you can do your muscles individually, even parts of your muscle, like the deltoid. You can pull your arm forward, upwards, backwards by pulling on different parts or contracting different parts of the deltoid muscle. But the heart, you don't want to do that. You want the whole thing to beat. So what you have is the main pacemaker, and it's right here. It's called the sinoatrial node. So it's at the intersection of the sinus where all the blood is pouring back into the right atrium, and then the atrium. So sinoatrial node tells you where it is. It's the sinus of the atrium. So it's right beside the superior vena cava. So you can orient yourself right there and see the superior and inferior vena cava. They didn't draw in the picture right here. All right, and these are bundles of nerves coming along here, And this is your backup pacemaker. And so this one is called the AV node, or the atrioventricular node. The AV node. Atrio, so it's at the intersection of the atrium and the ventricle, right there. So if things work out the way they're supposed to, your SA node sets the pace of your heart. So whenever you're looking at your pulse rate, you're saying, oh, my pulse rate's 70. Or, oh my goodness, I've been running and running and now my pulse rate's over 100. So this is the little area of the heart that sets the pace right there. If some damage occurs, so this no longer is pacing for your heart, then this one starts pacing. But unfortunately, it can only go about 60 beats per minute. So people who have lost the use of their sinoatrial node will find themselves very fatigued. And they'll find that their heart rate does not go up when they try to do cardiovascular exercise, when they try to walk or run. So this is good. It keeps you alive until maybe they can put a pacemaker in, an artificial pacemaker in, to replace this one. All right, so life being good and being the way it's supposed to be in a normal person, the SA node sets the pace. It sends the message down to the AV node, and from the AV node, it goes into the interventricular septum right there. And the area right here is called the bundle of His. It looks like it should be like his and hers, but you pronounce it more like a snake hiss, bundle of His, right there. And then it branches off in the left and right bundle branches, and then it comes on out, and then it branches out into the purkinje fibers. This is another artist representation showing it. So there's your SA node, sinoatrial node, which is the main pacemaker. And there's your AV node, or atrioventricular node, right there. The bundle of His going down into the interventricular septum. There's your bundle branches branching off of the bundle of His, going to the left and to the right, and then they curve up and branch out into the purkinje fibers. Purkinje fibers. That's why I showed you another picture so you can see the word purkinje fibers. So those are the 5 things that you need to know about the electrical system of the heart. If we were meeting in person, we would hook up 1 or 2 or 3 of the people in our class and look at their EKG or ECG tracings. So what you're responsible for is learning about in your textbook, for your lecture part. Know all the parts of an ECG tracing and physiologically what they represent. So we're going to spend a little time talking about that. And then you need to be able to identify normal and abnormal ECGs. So I'm sure you've watched a zillion TV shows and they have somebody in the hospital bed and you see that tracing that looks like this, and then all of a sudden the little alarm goes off and it goes, nee, and then you see that this flatlines. So their heart's no longer beating. So this is what your heart looks like when it's normally beating. So I said your heart is like an electrical system. So let's compare it to a battery. When you have a battery, you can hook something up to it and it will charge, because it has a charge in it, it will allow the thing to run. So you hook up your battery to your phone and your phone works. And then when you have no charge left, then your phone doesn't work anymore. So what we have in that analogy with your heart is your heart's all charged up and ready to beat. So it's full of electricity, and then it beats. So they call that a depolarization event. depolarization. So that's when your heart beats. And now it's basically dead. It's not going to beat again until your body recharges it. So luckily we do it a lot faster than plugging it into the wall. And then once it's recharged or repolarized, then you can depolarize it again. So that's how your heart beats. Now, because this is an electrical event, we can actually hook you up to a machine. So they tape little electrodes in various places on your body. And there's a nice little diagram that shows you exactly where to put each one so that you get the proper electrical readings. And here's what comes out on the oscilloscope. It looks like this, and then here are the atria depolarizing right there. And then they have to recharge. And then, because the electrical message goes from the sinoatrial node to the atrioventricular node, and then through the bundle of His, then it gets down into the intervertebral septum, and now the, not vertebral, interventricular septum. Sorry about that. And now the ventricles are going to depolarize. And so what you see here is the ventricle depolarizing. Now, since the atria are so small, this is all the deflection you get. But when the ventricles contract, boom, you get this really big peak. So it's very easy to tell which is which. And then when the ventricles repolarize, so they depolarize there, and you get the heartbeat, and they repolarize there. Okay, now you stop and think, oh, no, wait a minute. I should have 4 peaks. I should have the atria depolarizing and repolarizing, and then the ventricle depolarizing and repolarizing. Well, if you look right there, what happens is this one repolarizing occurs at the same time, so you can't differentiate it in this particular picture from this. So this is the atria depolarizing, and this is the atria repolarizing and the ventricles depolarizing. And then here's the ventricles repolarizing. Okay? Depolarize, depolarize, with this one repolarizing underneath it, and then repolarizing. And now I'm ready to go over here and do this again, right there. So if we look at this picture, you can see it. Depolarize, depolarize and repolarize, and then repolarize. A little pause there. Depolarize, depolarize and repolarize, repolarize. A little bit of a pause. If I had the time scale right here, I could tell you how fast the heart was beating. I'd simply count this many per second, and there's 60 seconds in a minute, and so I can tell you how many heartbeats there are. So you have to be able to tell what's going on in the P wave, and these are in alphabetical order. It's a P, Q, R, S, T. So you don't have to memorize any weird letters. If you can just remember it starts with P. Most people remember the QRS complex, and then they remember P's before and T is after. So whatever it takes to put it in your mind, P, QRS, T. So what's happening with the P wave? That's the atria depolarizing. What's happening with the QRS complex? So it's not just a wave, it's 2 different waves together, so it's a complex. It's the atria repolarizing, excuse me, and the ventricle depolarizing. Okay, and then the T wave is the ventricle repolarizing. So what's happening in the PR segment right there? Well, you've got the ventricles contracting, the atria contracting, so you know that the SA node has fired, and you know that the AV node is firing because it's at the bottom of the atria, and you're going to pass that electrical event, that depolarization event, through the bundle of His, and then your ventricles can depolarize. But remember, you've got to get it out of the atria, past the bundle of His, down into the interventricular septum, through those branches and out through the purkinje fibers. So that's what's happening right here. And then the ST right here, the atria is already repolarized. It did it here. So the atria is done and it's ready to go again as soon as it gets the signal. But now I have to repolarize right here the ventricles. So they want to know what's going on in the TP segment, and that's not toilet paper. That's going from T to the next P over here. So I'm already repolarized with my atria. I'm already repolarized with my ventricles. So they're just waiting for the message to come from the SA node to tell them it's time to beat again. So you're just kind of hanging out there waiting for the message. And as soon as you get the message, boom, there goes the atria depolarizing. Boom, there goes the ventricle depolarizing. And then now it has to repolarize and you're ready to go again. In your lab manual, it tells you how you'd hook the person up. You put a white lead on the right arm, a black lead on the right leg, and the red lead on the left leg. And then you calibrate. There are different EKGs or ECG readings that you're supposed to take. You're supposed to have whoever's hooked up do some exercise. So you should still see the same PQRS, TPQRS, but you'll see more of them per minute than you would when you were resting. So, and one of the questions that I know that I heard students talk about that they ask on some of the tests that seems kind of mean is if you have a patient and their heartbeat is over 130 beats per minute in a resting state. So they're not running up and down stairs, they're just sitting there and their heart rate is over 130. Is this abnormal? Is this tachycardia? And 99.9% of us would say, well, yes, of course it is. That's way too fast for your heart to beat. But it's a trick question. So anytime you're talking about heart rate, you have to ask, is it a man or a woman? And is it a baby, an adult, or an old person? Because the answer for what's normal is very different. For a baby, it's normal for their heart rate to be over 130. That's the normal heart rate for a baby. So for what would be tachycardia for me is definitely not tachycardia for a baby. So they want you to always be careful about who your patient is and what would be a normal reading for that particular patient before you start saying, well, this person has bradycardia, or can't talk tonight. Bradycardia and tachycardia. Brady means too slow heartbeat. Tachycardia means too fast heart rate for that particular age and sex person. Now, when you have a heart attack, part of the heart muscle dies. So hopefully it wasn't around the sinoatrial node, because then you're in trouble. So you're still getting the message through, and it goes down through the SA node, it goes down through the AV node, it goes through the bundle of His, it gets into the interventricular septum, and wherever the heart died, when the message goes out through the purkinje fibers, that part of the heart can't beat anymore. So it's usually replaced by scar tissue, and scar tissue can't beat, and it can't get the signal from the purkinje fibers so that everybody beats at the same time. All the muscle fibers beat at the same time. That part can't anymore. So depending on how extensive the damage is and where the muscle tissue died, it's going to change the shape of the PQRS waves. So here's a question they ask you. All right, someone has a fairly severe heart attack. So they're having a big chunk of their heart muscle that dies. Not enough to kill them, but it definitely is going to show up when you do a ECG or EKG on them. So, and it's funny, you can tell the person who wrote this lab manual switching over to EKG by mistake, and you'll hear me saying EKG. But anyway, it is a normal rhythm, but only for the P wave. And the QRS and the T waves are no longer in synchrony with the P wave. Okay, so I got the P going on, but the QRS is no longer beating with the P wave. So go back and look. Remember when we did this right here? What's going on in the PR region right there? What's going on in the ST segment right there? So what would cause the P wave to work, but the QRS complex doesn't work? So what was going on here? There's a little hint to help you answer that question. Right there. All right. So what part of the heart's damaged? And what is pacing the ventricles? What's causing the ventricles to beat? So we know that the SA node is causing the atria to beat, and we know that the P is okay. So it didn't damage that part. All right. So this is what the person looks like now. Look. P. Oops. Where's that QRS? P. P. There's a QRS. T. P. That's not a normal P. QRS. So something's happening in right here. And of course, this one, where nothing's working right, is a fibrillation right there. So here is a normal ECG, and there's a ventricular fibrillation. And that looks exactly like the picture that you have in your lab manual right there. So here's what happens in fibrillation. The reason we have the SA node pacing for us, and then the backup AV node in case the SA node is damaged, is so that the whole heart beats at the same time. If you have one part of the heart that's beating at a different time than the atria and then the ventricles beat, what's going to happen is you don't know who to listen to. It's kind of like if you have just one person talking and telling you to go do something, then you know just to go do something because you have one boss. But if you have several places in the heart that are depolarizing, they're telling all the cells nearby to also depolarize. So they're getting a message from the SA node and the AV node and the bundle of His and the purkinje fibers, but then they're also getting a different message from the nearby neighboring cells who are beating at a different time. So if you were to actually look at the heart that's in AFib or VFib, it's literally just jiggling like a bowl of jelly. It's just jiggling because it's beating all over the place in various places. So here's actually a video of the heart beating. And there goes the blood leaving. The picture in your lab manual shows you VFib, but this is what AFib looks like. So what do you do if the heart goes into fibrillation? You use a defibrillator, or what we see on TV. Somebody grabs the paddles tells everybody to stand clear, and then they jolt the heart with an electrical charge. So basically, you've got too many bosses. You've got the SA node trying to tell the heart what to do. You've got excitable regions in the heart muscle that are trying to beat at their own rhythm. And so when you run a charge of electricity through the body and through the heart, it causes all the muscle fibers to depolarize. So it's like somebody shouting. They're shouting louder. There's more electricity coming from the paddle than there is from the SA node that's coming from the heart cells that are beating at the wrong rhythm. So it overwhelms the whole electrical system of the heart. Everything depolarizes, and then everything repolarizes, and you should be ready to have a P wave, and then the QRS, and then the T, and then the P wave. So they'll put the paddle on, they'll jump start the person, basically, stop their heart, let it repolarize, and then see if it resumes beating correctly. Sometimes you have to use the paddles again to see if you can get the heart to go back. So that's what a defibrillator does. And it doesn't care if it's atrial fibrillation or ventricular fibrillation. That's it for this week's lab. Feel free to go online and look at other abnormal EKG or ECG tracings and see if you can figure out what's going on.